The industry narrative is clear. GitHub has won. Microsoft invested billions into it. Copilot is everywhere. GitHub Enterprise is the future, but in reality, that story is incomplete. Walk into any Fortune 500 company in 2026. Ask the CIO about their DevOps platform. You won't hear that they are all in on GitHub. You'll hear something different. They use GitHub for their AI teams, but Azure DevOps is where the governance lives. This isn't about features. It's not about who has the prettier interface. It's about a structural reality that nobody talks about. Compliance gravity. And it's reshaping how enterprises think about AI delivery in ways that most analysts completely miss. Why everyone thinks Ado is dying. The story is consistent. Every tech publication tells it the same way. Every analyst report reinforces it. Every migration playbook assumes it. GitHub dominates the developer mindset. Over 100 million developers use it. It's the default for new projects. The future of DevOps. The narrative says it's inevitable. Meanwhile, Azure DevOps gets labeled as legacy, mature, stable, the thing you use because you already have it, not because you chose it. The platform people are desperately trying to escape. And Microsoft itself seems to have made the choice. GitHub gets the AI investment. Copilot lives there. Repository intelligence, agentic workflows. These are the frontier features that get announced at conferences. Azure DevOps gets incremental updates to governance features nobody's excited about. Enterprise migration playbooks are literally titled From Azure DevOps to GitHub, not the other way around. The direction of travel seems obvious. The numbers appear to support this. GitHub Enterprise adoption is rising. Azure DevOps mindshare dropped from 16.7% to 9.5% between 2025 and mid-2026. That's a collapse on paper. The conversation in tech communities is dominated by when you should move off ADO, not if you should. So the narrative becomes self-reinforcing. Everyone believes ADO is legacy. That belief makes choosing ADO feel like choosing the past. Why invest in something dying? But here's where the narrative breaks completely. Walk into a regulated industry, a bank, a pharma company, a defense contractor, a healthcare system. Ask them about their DevOps platform choice. The answer is almost never that they are moving everything to GitHub. Instead, you hear that they are using both GitHub for innovation teams, Azure DevOps for core systems, or you hear that they can't move to GitHub yet because their compliance requirements aren't met, or you hear that they tried to migrate and it cost more than they expected. So they are keeping ADO for the parts where it actually delivers value. This is the narrative gap. The public conversation assumes a binary choice between two platforms. The enterprise reality is a portfolio decision. Different tools for different purposes. The research shows this clearly. Organizations that attempted a full migration from ADO to GitHub without careful workload analysis saw a 28% increase in developer tooling spend in year one. Organizations that used a selective hybrid approach realized 12 to 18% savings compared to maintaining the full legacy ADO estate. That's not a story about legacy tools dying. That's a story about structural value nobody's talking about. The mindshare decline from 16.7% to 9.5% looks like a collapse, but it's actually a relative decline, not an absolute one. ADO still serves a massive installed base. The decline reflects GitHub's explosive growth, not ADO's irrelevance. When analysts call ADO mature, they mean it's stable, well-integrated, and governance-heavy. For a Fortune 500 company managing mission-critical systems, that's not a weakness. It's the entire point. GitHub's innovation advantage is real. It's winning in AI, developer experience, and ecosystem breadth, but it's not winning in compliance, test management, or portfolio governance. Those are exactly the areas where regulated enterprises need the most help. The migration narrative is self-serving. Migration playbooks and consulting firms have an obvious incentive to recommend migration, but the actual ROI data tells a completely different story. The narrative gap exists because the public conversation is dominated by greenfield, cloud-native, startup-adjacent thinking. But the enterprise, the place where the actual money and real risk lives, operates under completely different constraints. And in 2026, those constraints are getting tighter, not looser. The compliance gravity model. There is a concept in physics called gravity wells. Massive objects create fields that pull everything toward them. The more mass you have, the stronger that pull becomes. Once you are inside the well, getting out takes an incredible amount of energy. In the world of enterprise software, compliance works exactly the same way. When an organization builds its governance, its audit trails, and its release processes around one platform, leaving isn't just a technical move, it is a structural reorganization of how the company actually functions. The deeper your compliance roots go, the harder it is to pull them out. Azure DevOps was built for this gravity well. It isn't necessarily because the tech is better, it is because the tool was designed for that specific reality. In practice, Azure DevOps is a fully integrated suite. Your repos, pipelines, boards, and test plans all live in one house. They are connected. A work item in a board links to a commit in a repo, which triggers a pipeline, which runs a test, which then creates the evidence for an audit. You can trace any change in production backward through the entire chain. Work item, to code, to test, to deployment, to the approval record. That integration is the gravity well. If you are a bank needing to prove SOX compliance or a healthcare provider protecting HIPAA data, that traceability isn't a nice-to-have feature. It is the reason you use the tool in the first place. You have spent 5 years building your audit processes around it. Your legal team knows how to find evidence there. Your lawyers know how to reconstruct the chain if something goes wrong. GitHub was built differently. It is a repository-first platform. It is amazing at source control and collaboration. But things like work management and formal release gates are not native to the core of GitHub. They are add-ons. They are integrations you have to layer on top. For a small startup, that is perfectly fine. You use GitHub for code, Jira for your boards, and ServiceNow for your changes. You are building from scratch, so you can pick and choose. But imagine a Fortune 500 bank. They have spent years perfecting their audit workflows inside Azure DevOps boards and test plans. Moving to GitHub means rebuilding every single one of those connections. The problem isn't that GitHub is worse. The problem is that the governance model doesn't map. Your auditors expect data from boards. Your compliance workflows look for evidence from test plans. Your release process is waiting for approvals from ADO pipelines. Replacing those pieces requires you to rebuild the entire compliance chain from the ground up. That work is expensive, it is risky, it breaks processes that auditors have already signed off on. It creates gaps where your evidence used to be a solid, continuous line. This is why big organizations stay put, even when GitHub looks better on paper. This is the compliance gravity model. It explains the reality that the marketing narrative usually ignores. Regulated companies stay on ADO longer than startups because the cost of leaving is structural. It isn't about which button is easier to click. It is about the fact that your compliance infrastructure is tangled up with the platform itself. This is why hybrid models are becoming the standard. Organizations cannot afford to move everything at once. They move what makes sense, like repositories, and they keep what is embedded in their governance. What people call a migration is usually just the birth of a hybrid stack. Companies aren't leaving ADO, they are just putting GitHub on top of it. That is why you see a 28% spike in costs during the first year. You are paying for two platforms while you try to manage the messy integrations between them. Azure DevOps isn't dying, it is specializing. It is becoming the control plane for the enterprise, while GitHub becomes the place where developers actually innovate. That isn't a legacy problem, that is architectural clarity. Why AI changes everything. Back in 2025, the debate between Azure DevOps and GitHub was mostly about features. People talked about CI/CD speed. They compared the repository experience. They looked at how well boards tracked work across different teams. The goal was always to find the platform that gave developers the smoothest experience. In 2026, that conversation is being completely rewritten. It isn't happening because of a new UI or a better feature set. It is happening because of AI governance. The EU AI Act is now being enforced, and it has introduced a requirement that changes the game for enterprise compliance. If you are deploying high-risk AI, you have to maintain continuous, structured evidence. This isn't an annual review where you hope nothing broke. This isn't a point-in-time audit where you check the boxes at the end of the year. This is proof that your AI was built, tested, and monitored under strict controls every single day it was running. That is a massive shift in how governance works. Traditional software governance was about managing change. Who approved the release? What was in the log? You could answer those questions after the fact. You could gather your evidence during an audit and tell a story about what happened. AI governance is about the entire pipeline. You have to know what data trained the model. You have to show how it was processed. You need to prove which safety checks ran before training started. You have to track how the system behaves in production and what happens when it starts to drift. Is it respecting access controls? Is it leaking data it shouldn't? Here is the part most companies are still missing. You cannot answer these questions after the fact. You have to prove it while it is happening. You have to show the test results and the deployment approvals in real time. It can't be a report you write later. It has to be an auditable chain of evidence. This is an orchestration problem. It is a logging problem. And it is exactly what Azure DevOps was built to handle. Azure DevOps pipelines don't just move code from point A to point B. They manage entire workflows. They log every single step, every approval, and every failure along the way. Think about a real-world scenario. An organization builds a RAG system for customer support. It pulls documents, ranks them, and uses them to give an LLM the right context. It sounds simple until you actually try to build it for an enterprise. The pipeline has to pull data from source systems. It has to validate that data against your compliance rules. It has to generate embeddings, update the vector store, and run retrieval tests. Then it has to run generation tests to make sure the AI isn't hallucinating. You need safety metrics. You need human approvals before it goes to production. You need to monitor it for drift once it is live. And if the quality drops, you need to trigger a reevaluation. That isn't a simple script. That is a complex orchestration with 7 different gates. Every one of those gates produces evidence that an auditor will eventually want to see. In 2026, you cannot deploy that system without proof that every step followed the rules. You need the logs, you need the approval records, you need the ability to trace a decision in production all the way back to the data that started it. Azure DevOps does this natively. The pipeline pulls the data, runs the checks, updates the store, and only moves to production if every single gate stays green. Every move is recorded, every failure is traceable. GitHub is great at CI/CD, but building an end-to-end AI pipeline with formal gates and audit trails isn't what it was made for. You would have to build that logic yourself on top of GitHub Actions. You would have to stitch together different tools and manage the mess. ADO just does it. This is the turning point. In 2025, GitHub was winning because developers loved it. In 2026, Azure DevOps is becoming essential because the compliance team requires it. And in the enterprise, compliance is no longer a side project. It is the main constraint. The LLMOps control plane. In 2026, something is happening inside Azure DevOps that the analyst reports haven't caught up with yet. Organizations aren't just using ADO for traditional software delivery anymore. They're repurposing it for something new, the LLMOps control plane. This isn't the LLM development platform, and it's not the infrastructure where models are trained. It's the orchestration layer that sits between experimentation and production. The system that says, you've built something promising in a notebook, now we move it to production, and here's how we ensure it stays safe, auditable, and compliant. Think about what an LLMOps control plane actually has to do. It manages versioning of prompts and retrieval configurations, while orchestrating evaluation pipelines that test for safety, quality, and regression before anything reaches production. It enforces approval gates so a human has to sign off before a new model version goes live, and it maintains audit trails of every single change. It monitors for drift once the system is live and triggers re-evaluation if behavior shifts, integrating security scanning and compliance checks as automatic gates in the pipeline. That's not a small job, and here's what matters. Azure DevOps pipelines were architected to do exactly that. Organizations in 2026 are implementing this in concrete ways. They're storing prompt templates and RAG configurations in Azure repos, and they're running automated evaluation tests in pipelines before any promotion to higher environments. They're using environment approvals to enforce that a human from the compliance team has to review and approve every production change. They're integrating safety checks, toxicity filters, bias detection, hallucination tests as automatic gates that either pass or block the pipeline. They're maintaining full traceability from the original requirement through code, through test results, through deployment to monitoring. This is not a new feature announcement from Microsoft, it's a new use case. Organizations are taking the existing ADO pipeline infrastructure that was built for traditional software and extending it to govern AI systems. And it works because the underlying architecture was already designed for this. Gated releases, approval workflows, artifact versioning, integrated logging. That's the DNA of Azure DevOps. It's purpose-built for situations where you need to prove that something happened under controlled conditions. GitHub can do similar things, but it requires more work. You'd have to build more custom integration, and you'd have to string together more separate tools. You'd have to manage more of the orchestration yourself. It's possible, but it's more operational complexity. For an organization that already has compliance infrastructure built around Azure DevOps, that has spent years building audit processes around ADO, the path of least resistance is obvious. Extend that same infrastructure to LLMOps. Use the tools you already have in the way they were designed to be used. This is why something unexpected is happening in 2026. Organizations that were planning a full migration to GitHub are hitting pause. Not because GitHub is bad, and not because they've decided GitHub can't work, but because they're starting to realize they need a governance layer for AI, and Azure DevOps already provides it. And rebuilding that governance on a different platform adds cost and complexity they didn't anticipate. The organizations deploying LLMOps today are using Azure DevOps as the orchestration backbone. They're using GitHub for repositories and AI-assisted coding, but the control plane, the system that ensures the LLM application stays safe, remains auditable, and stays compliant, is Azure DevOps. This represents a fundamental shift in how enterprises think about these platforms. It's not about features anymore. It's not about which interface is nicer or which ecosystem is bigger. It's about which platform was designed for the specific problem you're trying to solve. LLMOps requires something different from traditional DevOps. It's not just about orchestrating code and infrastructure. It's about orchestrating data, models, evaluations, and safety checks. Azure DevOps pipelines map directly to those needs. GitHub Actions can handle CI/CD. But orchestrating a complete LLMOps pipeline with formal gates, that's more complex on GitHub. This is the role that's emerging in 2026. Azure DevOps is becoming the system that ensures AI applications are deployed safely and compliantly, not the flashy innovation platform, the quiet backbone that keeps the AI system governance intact. Why hybrid is winning? By 2026, the market has settled this question in a way that surprised most analysts. The answer isn't pick one, it's use both intentionally. Not because one platform is universally better than the other, but because they were designed for different purposes. GitHub is the developer-facing innovation-focused layer where your best thinking happens. It's where AI-assisted coding actually changes how fast you move. It's where Copilot workspace and repository intelligence live, where the developer experience is optimized around how people actually work. Azure DevOps is the enterprise-facing, governance-focused layer. It's where compliance gets enforced, where audit trails get maintained, where release gates ensure that safety checks run before anything reaches production, where work items stay connected to code changes, to test results, to deployments. You don't have to choose between them. And increasingly, organizations realize they shouldn't. The pragmatic approach that's winning in 2026 looks like this. GitHub for repositories, pull requests, and CI/CD. Azure DevOps for boards, test plans, and the formal release orchestration that keeps high-risk systems safe, and integration automation to keep them talking to each other. This works because each platform is doing what it was designed to do. GitHub gives you the full AI-assisted development experience, a thriving ecosystem of community tools and templates, and an interface that makes developers productive. Azure DevOps gives you integrated governance, compliance infrastructure that actually works, and the ability to trace any production change backward through its entire lifecycle. You're not forcing a compromise. You're using the right tool for each layer of the problem. The integration story has actually improved significantly. In 2026, you can link GitHub commits and pull requests directly to Azure Board's work items. You can trigger Azure pipelines when events happen in GitHub. You can mirror Azure repos into GitHub or use GitHub as your primary repository while maintaining secondary visibility in ADO. You can synchronize identity and access management across both platforms from a single source. These integrations aren't perfect. They're not seamless like using a single platform would be, but they're functional, they're supported, and they're getting better. This means hybrid isn't a workaround anymore. It's becoming an architectural pattern that Microsoft actively supports. Here's how this looks in practice across real organizations. A financial services company moves new cloud-native repositories to GitHub. The team working on the core banking system stays on Azure DevOps. Why? Because that system has 5 years of audit process built around ADO. The cost to replace that is higher than the cost to maintain it. New systems don't have that baggage, so GitHub makes sense. A pharmaceutical company uses GitHub for their research and development AI models, but the systems that actually move compounds through clinical trials, those stay on Azure DevOps because the regulatory trail matters more than developer velocity. The traceability requirements are non-negotiable. A healthcare organization uses Azure Boards as the portfolio-level tracking system across the entire organization. Individual GitHub repositories handle tactical task management and code review. It's not perfect symmetry, but it works because each system is doing what it's actually good at. This isn't a compromise born of indecision, it's pragmatism. Organizations are solving the problem they have, not the problem they think they should have. And the evidence suggests it's working. Organizations running this hybrid model report lower total cost of ownership than organizations that tried forced full migration. They report higher developer satisfaction than organizations staying on ADO alone. They report better compliance posture than organizations that moved everything to GitHub alone. They have clearer governance boundaries than organizations trying to use one platform for everything. Hybrid is winning because it's honest about what each platform does well and stops forcing platforms to be something they're not. The portfolio decision framework. At this point, you've probably realized something. Choosing between Azure DevOps and GitHub isn't a binary choice, it's a portfolio problem. And portfolio problems need frameworks. The question isn't which platform should we use. The real question is which platform should we use for which workloads and how do we make that decision consistently? CIOs in 2026 are approaching this systematically. They aren't debating philosophically, they're classifying workloads and making allocation decisions based on specific characteristics. Start with workload classification. What actually matters when you're deciding where a system lives? Strategic importance. Does this workload drive competitive advantage, or is it just supporting infrastructure? An AI model that predicts customer churn is strategically different from an internal timekeeping system. One shapes how you compete, the other just keeps the lights on. Regulatory exposure. Does the workload touch regulated data, or is it internal tooling? A system handling healthcare data lives under different constraints than a project management tool for your engineering team. Development velocity. Does the team need to move fast, or does stability matter more? A research and development initiative has different timeline requirements than a system running transactions. Team maturity. Are these experienced engineers who can operate with minimal structure, or do they benefit from more framework and guardrails? That matters for which platform works best. Integration complexity. Does this system need to plug into legacy infrastructure, or is it greenfield? A system that has to synchronize with a mainframe system has different requirements than something you're building from scratch on cloud-native infrastructure. Once you've classified workloads along those dimensions, platform mapping becomes clearer. GitHub makes the most sense when you have greenfield work, experienced teams, minimal regulatory exposure, and velocity is the primary constraint. Cloud-native applications, open-source projects, AI-assisted development initiatives where you want to move fast. These workloads benefit from GitHub's developer experience, its ecosystem, and the AI capabilities built directly into the platform. Azure DevOps makes the most sense when the workload is regulated, legacy integration is required, formal governance is non-negotiable, or the team benefits from more structured processes. Financial systems, healthcare applications, complex enterprise programs where change management and audit trails are foundational to how the work happens. Hybrid makes sense for workloads with mixed characteristics. You want GitHub's speed and AI capabilities, but you need ADO's governance infrastructure. The system isn't fully greenfield, but isn't deeply entrenched in legacy systems either. It's important enough to govern formally, but fast enough to move quickly. Migration sequencing matters too. If you're actually moving workloads, don't start with your highest risk systems. Start with low-risk greenfield projects on GitHub. Build confidence, learn what works and what doesn't. Then take that learning to more complex scenarios. Keep high-risk, regulated workloads on Azure DevOps until you've proven you can maintain the same level of compliance on GitHub. Use hybrid for transitional workloads where you're testing the model but not betting the company on the outcome. Cost modeling brings this down to dollars. Status quo, staying on ADO only, has lower migration costs but higher opportunity costs. You're not capturing GitHub's developer productivity benefits. GitHub only has higher upfront costs. You're rebuilding pipelines. That's half a day to 2 days per pipeline. For a 200 pipeline organization, that's substantial labor. But long term, you might pay less operationally because you're not running two platforms. Hybrid has moderate costs in both categories. Migration costs are lower because you're only moving the workloads that make sense. Ongoing costs are higher because you're paying for both platforms. But most organizations find the total cost is lower than forced migration, and the outcome is better than staying on one platform alone. Governance design is the last piece. Once you've decided where workloads go, design governance to support the decision. Define which teams use which platform. Establish clear integration patterns. Create a central platform team that maintains templates and standards across both systems. Build dashboards that show metrics from both platforms so you're not flying blind. Establish a governance council that reviews decisions quarterly and adjusts as the landscape changes. This framework is practical. It's not about which platform is objectively better, it's about which platform fits which problem. Why audit requirements are changing. The governance standards that worked for traditional software are breaking down in the face of AI systems, and the difference isn't subtle. Traditional software governance asked about change. Who deployed this? When? What approvals happened? What was the change log? Those questions made sense because software was relatively predictable. You wrote code, you tested it, you deployed it. If something went wrong, you traced it back through your change management process. AI systems don't work that way. The behavior emerges from the intersection of data, training methodology, configuration choices, and runtime environment. The same code can produce different results depending on what data it encounters. The same model can behave differently when run on different hardware or against different input distributions. That fundamentally changes what auditors need to see. Data governance is now the starting point. You have to know exactly what data was used to train or fine-tune the model. Not just the dataset name, the actual data, where it came from, how it was collected, what processing was applied, what safeguards were in place to ensure it doesn't contain prohibited content like personal information or copyrighted material. When you update the model, you have to document what data changed. When you deploy a new version, you have to verify that the data is still compliant. And this isn't about policy documentation. It's about maintaining a complete, auditable record of every data transformation from source to training to deployment. Training and configuration governance works the same way. You have to document exactly how the model was built. What base model did you start from? What hyperparameters did you use? What safety measures were applied during training? What alignment techniques were used to shape behavior? If someone asks, why does the model respond to this input the way it does? You have to be able to trace it back to deliberate training decisions, not accidents or luck. Evaluation and testing governance is where the evidence becomes concrete. Before any AI system reaches production, it has to pass systematic evaluation. Not just one test, multiple tests, safety testing, bias testing, hallucination testing, compliance testing. You have to document not just the results, but the methodology. What test cases did you use? How did you define pass-fail criteria? What was the rationale for each threshold? And you have to maintain that evidence, not archived somewhere, available for inspection, auditable. Deployment and monitoring governance means you have to prove that the system was released under approved controls. What version of the model is actually running in production? What version of the configuration? What version of the data pipeline feeding it? You have to be able to reconstruct at any point in time what was deployed, when it was deployed, who approved it, and what monitoring showed. Incident and remediation governance is the part most organizations underestimate. When something goes wrong, the model produces biased results, returns something it shouldn't, fails to handle an edge case correctly. You have to document everything. The incident, when it was detected, how it was investigated, what changes were made to fix it, why those specific changes address the root cause. You have to maintain that incident history and make it auditable. This is a comprehensive end-to-end compliance model, and it's completely different from we have a change control process. It's exactly the kind of orchestrated, documented, auditable workflow that Azure DevOps was architected to support. Pipelines that log every step, approvals that create an approval record, artifacts that maintain version history, integration between repositories and work items, and test results that creates the traceability chain. This is why audit requirements are driving enterprise adoption of Azure DevOps in ways that feature comparisons never could. The RAG governance pattern, RAG systems, Retrieval Augmented Generation, are the standard for enterprise AI in 2026. But they expose a hard truth. The governance conversation matters more than the feature conversation. On paper, a RAG system is simple. You have a retrieval layer to pull documents, a ranking system to score them, a generation layer to ground the LLM response. But in reality, Each component is a governance failure waiting to happen. Take the retrieval layer. It's only as good as your knowledge base. You have to know what's actually in there. Where did the documents come from? Is the information current, or are you serving stale data to your users? And one level deeper, does that knowledge base contain regulated data? Customer info, proprietary research, confidential emails? If it does, you have to ask, who is allowed to see it? If an unauthorized user queries the system, the retrieval layer must respect those boundaries. But here's the problem. Governance isn't a one-time setup. When documents change, the knowledge base changes. When the knowledge base changes, the behavior of your AI changes. You can't just drop files into a folder and hope for the best. You have to maintain that logic every single day. When you add a document, you validate it. When you modify one, you re-embed it. When you delete one, you update the index immediately. The ranking layer adds even more complexity. You have to decide how many documents to return and which algorithm ranks them. You have to set a confidence threshold to decide when the system should just give up and fall back to the base model. These are deliberate choices, and those choices dictate how your AI behaves in the real world. Testing this means asking uncomfortable questions. Does it actually find the right info, or does it miss the point and return noise? Does it accidentally leak a document that should have been locked down? You need proof. You have to maintain evidence that the system was tested and that it actually passed. Then there's the generation layer. This is where safety happens. The LLM is supposed to stay grounded in your documents, but LLMs hallucinate. They invent facts. They blend info in ways that are flat out misleading. They can expose secrets even if the retrieval layer worked perfectly. So you test the generation layer separately. Does the LLM stay inside the lines? Does it handle cases where the documents don't have the answer? You test these properties, and you keep the receipts. This is an orchestration problem. The retrieval layer has to talk to the generation layer. The knowledge base has to stay in sync with the vector store. You have to monitor for drift, where the behavior shifts even though you didn't change a line of code. Azure DevOps pipelines handle this natively. You build a pipeline that pulls from source systems and validates the data. It generates embeddings and updates your store. It runs retrieval tests to verify the ranking and generation tests to verify the safety. It enforces approval gates before anything hits production. That's a complete RAG governance lifecycle. Every step is logged. Every approval is recorded. The evidence chain is continuous, not something you try to scramble and reconstruct after an audit fails. The alternative is building this yourself on GitHub. You use GitHub for code, another tool for evaluation, a third tool for monitoring. You have to glue them together. You have to maintain the orchestration. It's possible, but it's complex, it's error-prone, and it's a nightmare to audit. For a regulated organization, Azure DevOps is the direct path. The 28% migration trap. Here's what happens when an organization decides to move everything from Azure DevOps to GitHub, and I mean everything. The repos, the pipelines, the boards, the test plans, a total cutover. In the first year, they see a cost increase of 28%. This isn't a guess. Analysis of enterprise negotiations across multiple large companies shows this happens every time. It catches CIOs off guard because the move looked like a massive cost-saving win on the spreadsheet. The trap starts with license overlap. You can't just flip a switch and shut down Azure DevOps on day one. Teams are still working in ADO while others are learning GitHub. You run both platforms in parallel. GitHub Enterprise Cloud is about $231 per user. ADO Basic is only $72. If you have 100 developers, you're paying over $30,000 a year during the transition, when you used to pay $7,000. That overlap usually lasts 18 to 24 months, not the 3 months you planned for. But the licenses are actually the cheap part. The real pain starts when you rebuild your pipelines. Azure pipelines and GitHub Actions are conceptually similar, but the execution models are completely different. The error handling is different. The integrations are different. You don't just move a pipeline. You rewrite it from scratch. The industry average is about 1 to 2 days of work to rebuild and validate a single pipeline. That sounds fine for one app. But most organizations have 200 or 300 pipelines. If you have 200 pipelines and each takes a full day, that's 200 days of engineering time. At a loaded rate of $200 an hour, you're looking at $320,000 in labor alone. And that's before you find the edge cases in production, before you retrain the staff. Then you hit the boards and test plans problem. If you rely on Azure boards for complex planning and hierarchy, GitHub projects isn't going to cut it. It's not feature equivalent. Most companies that leave boards end up buying Jira too. Now you're paying for GitHub plus Jira. That's a new license, a new migration, more retraining. Azure Test Plans is the same story. It's a specialized tool for regulated environments. GitHub doesn't have a native version of it, so you either keep paying for ADO just for the test plans, or you buy a whole new testing suite. Either way, your license count isn't going down. The operational overhead ties it all together. You're maintaining links between GitHub and ADO. You're syncing work items. You're managing 2 different identity systems. This is the 28% trap. It's not one big bill, it's 5 medium costs that compound until the project is underwater. Organizations fail here because they focus on the GitHub sticker price and ignore the rebuild labor and the platform overlap. But there is an alternative, a selective hybrid model. You move the repos and pipelines that actually benefit from GitHub. You keep boards and test plans in Azure DevOps where they work best. That approach actually leads to savings of 12 to 18% because you're only moving the pieces that make sense, instead of forcing a replacement that doesn't need to happen. The TCO model for CIOs. By 2026, CIOs have stopped debating the philosophy of the cloud. They are modeling the reality in spreadsheets. When you build a detailed total cost of ownership model, you have to look at migration labor, license overlap, and rebuild effort. You also have to account for integration overhead and operational costs across a 5-year window. When you do that, something interesting emerges. Hybrid does not just look better on paper. It wins almost every time. Let's look at how a typical model works for a 100-person development shop running 200 pipelines. You start with year one costs. If you choose a full migration to GitHub, you are paying for GitHub Enterprise at $231 per user annually. That is $23,100 for your 100 developers. But you are still running Azure DevOps in parallel during the transition, so you add another $7,200 for those seats. Copilot licenses at $20 monthly per user add $24,000 a year to the bill. Then you hit the labor. Rebuilding a pipeline takes about 1 day on average. For 200 pipelines, that is 200 days of engineering time. At a $200 loaded hourly rate, you are looking at roughly $320,000 just for the move. Training and change management for 100 developers will cost you another $20,000 to $40,000. Finally, you have to budget $10,000 to $50,000 for the integration work required to keep your systems talking to each other. Your year one total for a full GitHub migration runs between $405,000 and $465,000. The midpoint estimate is roughly $440,000. Now, look at the model for selective hybrid. You move the repositories that actually make sense, like new cloud-native projects, AI teams, or innovation initiatives. You keep boards and test plans in Azure DevOps because your compliance processes are already built around them. Instead of 200 pipelines, you are only rebuilding 100. GitHub and Copilot licenses stay the same, and ADO licenses remain at $7,200. The big shift is in the labor costs. Your pipeline rebuild is now 100 days instead of 200, which drops that cost from $320,000 down to $160,000. Training is lighter because you aren't forcing people onto a new boards experience, so you only spend $10,000 to $20,000 there. Integration work is bounded because you aren't trying to replicate every single ADO capability inside GitHub. Your year one total for selective hybrid comes to roughly $210,000 to $270,000. The midpoint is $240,000. That is a $200,000 difference in the first year alone. Year 2 through year 5 look a bit different. With a full GitHub migration, your ongoing costs are about $280,000 annually for licenses, Copilot, and maintenance. With selective hybrid, you are paying for both platforms, so your ongoing costs are closer to $310,000 a year. That is $30,000 higher every year. But here's where the math works. Your $200,000 savings in year 1 means you break even on those higher ongoing costs by the middle of year 2. After that point, the hybrid model starts to compound its financial advantage. The 5-year total cost of ownership for a full GitHub migration is roughly $1.9 million. Selective hybrid costs roughly $1.49 million. That gives the hybrid approach a $410,000 advantage over 5 years. This analysis does not even factor in productivity benefits, though those are very real. Organizations that move to GitHub see measurable gains from Copilot and a better developer experience, which usually leads to a 5 to 10% efficiency jump. Organizations that keep boards see compliance benefits that reduce audit friction and regulatory risk. A conservative estimate for that productivity value is $750,000 to $1.5 million annually for 100 developers. That value exists no matter which path you choose, so it does not change the comparison between the two. What actually changes is the risk. A full migration concentrates all your risk into one big execution. Hybrid spreads that risk across time and different types of workloads. Full migration forces every single person to learn new governance models at the same time. Hybrid lets adoption happen at different speeds for different teams. This is the analysis driving CIO decisions in 2026. It is not about being a fan of one tool or the other. It is purely financial. Selective hybrid delivers better economics, lower risk, and the same outcomes. How organizations actually migrate. The way organizations actually migrate looks nothing like the playbooks. The playbooks assume you make a strategic decision in the first quarter, plan through the second, execute in the third, and stabilize by the end of the year. It looks clean, sequential, and predictable. But that is not what happens in the real world. The real process is iterative. An organization identifies a low-risk project, usually something new that isn't heavily regulated. They pick an experienced team that won't fall apart if the migration hits a snag. They move that one project to GitHub and run it in production for 3 to 6 months. They document every single thing that broke and everything that worked. Then they take those lessons and move the next batch of projects. They rinse and repeat this cycle. By the time they have moved 5 projects successfully, they start to feel confident. By the time they have moved 15, they finally understand their actual costs and risks. They aren't looking at theoretical numbers from a playbook anymore. This approach is slower than a big coordinated migration, but the risk is much lower. It allows organizations to adjust their strategy as they learn. The first project teaches you what you didn't know you didn't know. The fifth project tests whether that first success was just a fluke. By the 15th project, you actually understand the mechanics of what works for your specific culture. During this iterative process, running systems in parallel is unavoidable. The same code lives in both Azure repos and GitHub, and the same pipelines run in both Actions and Azure pipelines. You might even track the same work items in both Azure boards and GitHub issues until a team fully commits. It is inefficient to maintain duplicate data and test two systems at once, but it is safe. Teams can learn the new platform without the pressure of a bet the business deadline. Parallel running buys you the time to discover the problems you didn't plan for. Most organizations never actually move everything. They discover early on that some things make sense to move while others are better left alone. They move repositories that are new or less connected to legacy infrastructure. They move pipelines for applications built on cloud-native patterns, but they keep Azure boards if their compliance processes are wrapped tightly around it. They keep Azure test plans if their formal QA depends on that specific tool. They keep pipelines if they have built complex release orchestration that is tied to enterprise governance. This selective retention is just being pragmatic. It lets you capture the benefits of GitHub without blowing up the governance infrastructure that depends on ADO. The integration challenge starts to show up once you are actually running a hybrid setup. Work items created in GitHub have to link back to Azure boards. Commits pushed to GitHub must be traceable in ADO. Your identity and access management systems have to stay perfectly synchronized. Service connections and authentication tokens have to work across both platforms without failing. This requires custom automation and a lot of discipline in how teams name and link things. You have to plan your access management carefully so people can work in both systems without getting confused or creating security gaps. Most organizations underestimate this part of the job. They think integration is just a small bit of overhead. Then they discover that keeping two massive systems in sync is much harder than they expected. Team dynamics make everything more complicated. Some teams love GitHub and will move as fast as you let them. Other teams are comfortable with ADO and will resist the change. Some teams are split right down the middle. Managing these people dynamics is just as important as the technical migration. Organizations that treat this as a change management problem rather than just a tech problem are the ones that succeed. Organizations that assume everyone will just naturally adopt the new platform are the ones that struggle. By the time organizations have real experience with this, they all report the same lessons. Full migration always takes longer and costs more than the initial estimate. Selective hybrid is a more pragmatic choice than forcing a full move. Integration between the two platforms is harder than it looks on a slide deck. Team adoption moves faster when you give people a choice instead of a mandate. You have to redesign your governance, not just migrate it. The benefits of GitHub, like the AI features and the developer experience, are very real, but they take time to actually realize. The compliance infrastructure you spent years building in ADO does not automatically move over to GitHub. You have to rebuild it from scratch, and that rebuilding process is exactly where most organizations start to stumble. The hybrid operating model. The organizations succeeding with hybrid stacks in 2026 aren't just running two platforms. They've designed an operating model around the split. Most organizations miss this. They start hybrid without architecture. And that's where it breaks. It starts with platform allocation. This sounds obvious, but most organizations get it wrong. You don't split by team randomly. You create clear criteria for what lives where. GitHub owns the code, repositories, pull requests, CI/CD through GitHub Actions, security scanning like CodeQL and Dependabot, and AI-assisted development where Copilot lives. Azure DevOps owns the structure, the board system for portfolio and program planning, test plans for formal QA and evidence, pipelines for complex release orchestration where approval gates are critical, and artifacts for versioned dependencies that regulatory processes depend on. The integration points must be defined explicitly. Work items sync between platforms. Commits link back to boards items. Pipelines trigger across systems. Dashboards aggregate metrics from both. But here's the problem. This allocation only works if you build governance architecture around it. A central platform team defines the standards. They maintain templates in both systems, but they aren't gatekeepers. Domain teams, product, infrastructure, security operate within those standards. They choose the platform that fits their workload. A governance council meets quarterly. They review decisions. They resolve conflicts. They adjust standards as experience accumulates. This council includes engineering leadership, security, compliance, and the platform team. Without them, hybrid devolves into chaos. Every team makes independent decisions. You end up with no consistency. Identity and access management becomes critical. Now you have two platforms to manage. You need a single source of truth, Entra ID or Azure AD. You synchronize groups and roles across both systems. A developer should have one identity that works in both GitHub and Azure DevOps. Permissions are defined in one place and reflect in both. If someone changes roles, their access changes everywhere simultaneously. You run regular access reviews across both platforms, not separately. You establish clear permission models. It must be obvious who can do what in each platform. The synchronization isn't automatic. It requires deliberate architecture and ongoing maintenance. Integration automation is where most organizations struggle. They underestimate the complexity. Work items created in GitHub have to appear in Azure boards. Commits pushed to GitHub need to link back to ADO work items. Pipelines in one system trigger work in another. There are third-party tools that handle some of this. Services that sync work items between GitHub and ADO exist. But there's always custom automation required. You're building bridges, and bridges need maintenance. Metrics and measurement must span both platforms. You measure DORA metrics across both GitHub and Azure DevOps. Lead time for changes, deployment frequency, change failure rate, mean time to recovery. You measure developer satisfaction. You measure compliance metrics like audit trail completeness and approval gate compliance. And you measure cost per outcome, not just cost per user. These metrics tell you if your allocation is working. If one platform consistently underperforms, you adjust. Change management is subtle but essential. You communicate clearly about which workloads go where and why. You provide training for teams on both platforms. You identify champions in each team who help adoption. You run retrospectives monthly at first, then quarterly. You surface what's working and what's breaking. That feedback loop is how you know if the model works in practice. The platform team is the backbone of hybrid. They maintain reusable templates in both systems. They manage integrations. They provide guidance to teams. They respond when integration breaks. They monitor whether governance is actually being followed. They measure adoption metrics. This role didn't exist in pure ADO or pure GitHub organizations. It emerges because hybrid complexity requires dedicated ownership. Without a platform team, hybrid fails. A transition timeline is realistic. Months 1 through 3 are design and pilot. Months 4 through 6 expand to multiple teams and refine based on what breaks. Months 7 through 12 are full rollout. Year 2 is optimization. This takes time because integration issues surface slowly. You need that time to build confidence before scaling. What's coming in 2027 and beyond? The trajectory is becoming clear. By 2026, the narrative has shifted. It's no longer about which platform wins. It's about how do these platforms work together. That shift points toward what's happening next. Microsoft will keep tightening the integration between GitHub and Azure DevOps, not because one platform is failing, but because the market has spoken. Organizations want both. The investment will go into making them work together more seamlessly. You'll see deeper work item synchronization, real-time sync where a status change in GitHub reflects in ADO within seconds, better pipeline orchestration where events in one system trigger workflows in the other. Unified dashboards will show metrics from both platforms without switching contexts. Identity and access management will feel like a single system. Even though it's technically two, this convergence isn't going to make hybrid perfect, but it will make it less painful to operate. AI governance is where the next wave of investment actually matters. Organizations are moving LLM systems from pilots into production. Governance requirements are tightening. The EU AI Act enforcement is real, and it's expensive to get wrong. Both platforms will respond by building AI governance as a first-class feature, not an afterthought. Expect native support for AI evaluation pipelines, not just custom scripts, but a system to version prompts, run safety evaluations, and enforce approval gates. Better audit trails are coming specifically designed for AI, not general-purpose logging, but trails that capture the lineage of data, training decisions, and evaluations. Integrated safety checks and compliance gates will automatically block unsafe configurations. Eventually, we'll see AI-powered governance itself. Machine learning models will watch your deployment pipelines. They will flag potential compliance issues before they happen. Azure DevOps will likely move faster here. That's where governance lives. But GitHub will catch up because it's the platform where innovation teams are building AI. LLMOps will become its own category. It's not MLOps, it's not traditional DevOps, it's something different. You'll see purpose-built LLMOps platforms emerge. They will specialize in managing the unique challenges of LLM applications. Prompt versioning, evaluation orchestration, model routing, safety monitoring. These platforms will integrate with both GitHub and Azure DevOps. They won't replace them. They'll plug into your existing pipeline architecture. They add the AI-specific layer that general-purpose platforms can't provide natively. The platform team role will become table stakes in large organizations. Right now, it's emerging. In 2027, it will be standard. You'll have dedicated platform engineering teams in most Fortune 500 companies. Their job is to maintain the internal developer platform. They abstract away the complexity of hybrid models. They build reusable templates. They manage integrations. They provide governance. These teams will treat their internal platform like a product, with users, with support, with roadmaps. Regulations will keep tightening. The EU AI Act is just the first domino. Other countries are building their own frameworks. International harmonization is coming. Every new regulation will require tighter audit trails, better evidence logging, more formalized governance. And every regulation will push enterprises toward platforms designed for governance. That's Azure DevOps territory. The developer experience frontier will stay on GitHub. Copilot will get more sophisticated. Agentic workflows will become more powerful, repository intelligence will deepen, but GitHub won't try to become a governance platform. It will stay developer-focused. Organizations will accept that trade-off. You'll see consolidation in the broader tooling ecosystems. Some platforms will disappear, some will be acquired. Most organizations will standardize on a core stack. GitHub plus Azure DevOps plus specialized tools. They will stop trying to mix 8 different platforms. The era of infinite point solutions is ending. By 2027, hybrid isn't an interim state. It's the permanent architecture. Organizations will stop treating it as a migration destination. They will start treating it as the intended design. The question won't be, when do we get to one platform? It will be, how do we make this architecture work better? How CIOs should think about this. The fundamental mistake CIOs make is treating this as a platform choice. It's not. It's a strategic decision about how your organization actually delivers software. The platform follows the strategy, not the other way around. Start by asking what you're actually trying to optimize for. Every organization says they want both speed and compliance, but when you're forced to choose, which one wins? If your answer is we need both equally, you're not thinking clearly. That's exactly the kind of indecision that leads to terrible outcomes. The organizations that succeed have clarity on their optimization vector. Are you optimizing for developer velocity and innovation? Then your strategy has GitHub at the center. That doesn't mean you ignore governance. It means governance exists to unblock shipping, not slow it down. And you accept that some traditional controls need to shift. Formal change advisory boards and multi-stage release approvals move toward automated, lightweight enforcement. Are you optimizing for compliance and regulatory risk reduction? Then Azure DevOps is structurally aligned with that priority. You're not choosing ADO because the interface is nice. You're choosing it because traceability and audit capability are built into how the product works. You accept that development will feel slower because governance gates are real. You manage the speed problem through education and better process design, not by removing the gates. Most large organizations aren't optimizing for one thing. They're managing a portfolio where different workloads have different pressures. That's the real insight. The choice isn't binary. The choice is which workloads optimize for which outcomes. And then platform selection flows from that classification. This framework changes how you think about the decision. You're not debating which platform is objectively better. You're defining the decision criteria that matter for each class of work, then choosing the platform that fits. Take governance as an example. In the abstract, most CIOs agree it's important. But what does governance actually mean for a customer-facing AI system versus an internal tooling project? For the AI system, you need audit trails that prove you tested for bias, ran safety evaluations, and enforced approvals. For the internal tool, you probably need a simpler approval workflow and less rigorous evidence logging. Same concept, different implementation. This is where a platform team becomes essential, because the team has to translate the strategic priorities into actual platform policies. If you've decided that certain workloads need formal governance, the platform team makes sure that governance is enforced consistently. They don't debate whether governance is good. They implement the governance your strategy demands. Measurement matters here in a way that surprises most CIOs. You can't manage what you don't measure. If you're running hybrid, you need metrics that span both platforms. Not how many developers are on GitHub versus ADO, but what's the actual cost per delivered feature across both platforms? What's the compliance gap we're carrying? What's the developer satisfaction difference between teams using GitHub and teams using ADO? These metrics drive adjustment. The measurement creates feedback loops. You discover that your classification of which workload goes where was wrong. A system you thought was low risk turned out to need more governance than you assumed. A team you thought needed structure actually works better with autonomy. The metrics tell you where your assumptions broke, and then you adjust. This iterative approach, classify, allocate, measure, adjust, is how organizations actually navigate hybrid successfully. Not through perfect initial planning, but through structured learning. You make a decision, you measure the outcome, you adjust, and over time, the allocation becomes more accurate. The role of the CIO in 2026 isn't to make a perfect platform choice upfront. It's to establish a decision framework that lets the organization make better platform choices iteratively as the landscape changes and as you learn more about your actual workloads and constraints. The strategic clarity. Here's what you need to understand as we close this out. The entire premise of this conversation has been built on a false binary. The industry narrative says GitHub won. Your operational reality says Azure DevOps is where the actual governance happens. Both statements are true, and that truth is the actual insight. In 2026, the question, should we use Azure DevOps or GitHub, is the wrong question. It's like asking whether you should use TCP or HTTP. They're different layers solving different problems. The right question is, What does my organization actually need to accomplish, and which platform lets us accomplish it most efficiently? For some organizations, that answer is GitHub first. The organization is cloud native, the team is experienced, regulatory exposure is minimal, velocity is the competitive advantage. In that context, you move to GitHub and you don't look back. You're not sacrificing anything that matters. For some organizations, Azure DevOps is genuinely the right answer. The workloads are regulated. Compliance isn't a secondary concern, it's the primary constraint. The systems are deeply integrated with legacy infrastructure. In that context, staying on ADO isn't a conservative choice, it's the pragmatic choice. But for most large organizations, and this is the critical insight nobody in the press talks about, the answer is neither. It's both. You build a hybrid architecture, you allocate workloads based on their actual characteristics, and you design governance that makes both platforms work together. This hybrid approach isn't a compromise. It's not, we couldn't decide, so we're running both. It's a deliberate structural decision that acknowledges a reality. One platform cannot simultaneously optimize for developer velocity and compliance rigor. GitHub leans into velocity. Azure DevOps leans into compliance. You need the velocity for innovation. You need the compliance for risk management. So you use both in the roles each was designed for. The breakthrough here is this. Organizations that accept this premise upfront, that hybrid is the intended architecture, not a temporary state, make better decisions faster. They don't waste energy debating which platform is better. They classify their workloads, they allocate them, they build integrations, they measure outcomes, and they move forward. The organizations that are struggling are the ones still trying to find the one true platform. They believe there's a right answer they haven't found yet. They keep reading about GitHub's advantages and wondering if they're making a mistake staying on ADO. They explore migration and get spooked by the cost. They're stuck in indecision because the binary framework broke, and they don't have a better framework yet. You now do. Here's how to use it. Monday morning framework. The first step is an honest classification of what you actually own. Not what you want to own, not what you think you should own. What you actually own right now. This inventory takes work, and you need to know the details. What repositories do you have? Where do they live? What do your pipelines actually do? How deep is the integration with your legacy systems? Which teams are locked into Azure boards or test plans? Where is your governance actually enforced today? You can't make a good decision without those answers. But most organizations can't answer them from memory. You have to count. You have to look. You have to understand exactly what you're carrying. That inventory is your baseline. From there, the framework gets mechanical. For every major workload, you have to ask a few questions. Is this new or legacy? New workloads usually mean GitHub makes sense. Legacy workloads mean Azure DevOps is the safer bet, unless you want to rebuild your governance from scratch. Is this regulated? High regulatory exposure points you toward Azure DevOps. Low exposure means GitHub is probably fine. If it's somewhere in the middle, you need to think through the answer carefully. Does this system talk to other systems? Heavy integration with old infrastructure suggests you stay with ADO. You're already using those capabilities. Lighter integration gives you more freedom to choose. What is your primary constraint? If you need velocity, GitHub helps. If you need compliance, ADO was designed for it. If you are honestly constrained by both, hybrid is the only answer. What does the team look like? Experienced teams can usually operate in either environment. Teams new to DevOps benefit from the structure ADO provides. Cloud-native teams usually want the lighter touch of GitHub. These inputs aren't secrets. Every CIO already has an opinion on them. The framework just makes those opinions explicit once you classify the workloads. Allocation is easy. GitHub for speed, Azure DevOps for compliance, hybrid for when you need both. That allocation then determines everything else. It sets your standards, it defines your integrations. It builds your governance model. The governance redesign. Here's where most organizations stumble. They get the allocation right, they start moving the workloads, and then they realize their governance model doesn't port over. Azure Boards has a specific way of organizing work. Epics roll up into features. Features roll up into stories. Stories roll up into tasks. There is hierarchy. There is queryability. There are custom fields and complex workflows. You've probably spent years tuning how those boards look. GitHub doesn't work that way. GitHub has repositories and issues. Issues have labels and milestones. That's it. There is no native hierarchy. There is no epic to task rollup. If you try to force your Azure Boards model into GitHub, you'll spend a year fighting the tool. So the governance has to change. Not just the tech, the structure. For GitHub workloads, governance becomes lighter. High-level planning stays in Azure Boards. That's your portfolio layer. But the tactical work moves to GitHub issues. Epics become milestone groupings. Features become GitHub projects. Stories become issues. The workflow is less formal, and the gates are less rigid. You are optimizing for speed. For Azure DevOps workloads, governance stays formal. The hierarchy remains. The test plans stay. The formal release gates stay, because in these environments, compliance isn't negotiable. For hybrid workloads, you keep the portfolio structure in boards. That is your source of truth for business outcomes. Individual features might live in GitHub, but their relationship to the big picture flows through boards. This is the redesign most people miss. They assume governance is portable. It's not. Governance is structural. It flows from the platform architecture. When you change the platform, the governance changes with it. The organizations that win treat this as a deliberate shift. The governance council meets, they map the old model against the new one. They document the changes, they train the teams, and then they enforce it. Governance doesn't go away. It just becomes platform appropriate. You aren't trying to make GitHub work like Azure DevOps. You're designing governance that works with the platform, not against it. The integration pattern. There is a specific moment in every hybrid journey where the reality hits. Organizations realize that integration is much harder than they expected. You create a work item in GitHub. It doesn't show up in Azure boards. You push a commit. It doesn't link back to ADO. Changes in one system never reach the other. Nothing happens automatically. You have to build the connection yourself. And building that connection takes real effort. You can find third-party tools to handle parts of this. There are services to sync work items and tools to track commits across repositories, but you will always run into custom work. Every organization has slightly different needs. The teams that actually win with hybrid don't treat integration as a side effect. They treat it as a deliberate architecture problem. They build patterns. They set naming conventions so linking actually works. They build the automation that keeps everything in sync. This is what that pattern looks like in practice. A developer opens an issue in GitHub. They tag that issue with a specific pattern like org project 001 to make it discoverable. That naming convention allows your automation to find the issue and link it to the right Azure boards item. You have to build that automation on purpose. It isn't a one-off fix for a single team. It is a standard that applies to every repository and every person. If your integration isn't a standard, it fragments. Teams start doing things their own way. The links fail. And that is exactly where the hybrid model breaks. The same logic applies to your pipelines. You might run GitHub Actions for fast testing and Azure pipelines for formal releases. Those systems have to talk. GitHub Actions must be able to trigger Azure pipelines. Azure pipelines must be able to pull outputs from GitHub and use them as inputs. None of that is automatic. It is deliberate work. High-performing organizations usually set up a platform team to own this layer. This team is separate from your product teams. Their entire job is to build and maintain the integrations that hold the system together. They create the templates. They embed the naming conventions. They build the automation. And when a link breaks, they are the ones who fix it. This is not a small or optional role. In a large organization, this team might be 5 people or more. They are the only reason the hybrid model doesn't collapse under its own weight. The measurement regime. You cannot manage what you do not measure. Hybrid setups add layers of complexity, and you need data to navigate them. Your standard DevOps metrics have to span both platforms. You need to see DORA metrics, cycle time, and deployment frequency in one place. You cannot look at GitHub and Azure DevOps as 2 separate islands. You need a unified view, but this is harder than it sounds. The 2 platforms do not report data in the same way. GitHub lacks native test metrics, while Azure DevOps lacks native security metrics. To see the full picture, you have to build your own dashboards to bring that data together. The real challenge isn't technical, it's strategic. You have to measure if your original decisions were actually right. Are the workloads you move to GitHub actually moving faster? Are the teams on Azure DevOps actually maintaining better compliance? Is the hybrid model delivering the balance you expected? If a GitHub project is failing its compliance checks, you need to know that immediately. It might mean you put the wrong workload in the wrong place, or maybe the team just needs more structure. Either way, the data tells you there is a problem. If an Azure DevOps project is crawling because of governance overhead, the data tells you if that trade-off is worth it. Maybe the slowness is acceptable, maybe it isn't, but you need the numbers to make that call. The best setups I have seen use a monthly review. The platform team pulls metrics from both systems and compares them to the baseline. They look for anomalies. They investigate the gaps. Then they make recommendations on where to move workloads or how to change the process. This review is how the hybrid model actually learns. You stop guessing about what works. You measure it, and then you adjust based on the evidence. The 3-year outlook. I want to share what I'm confident will happen over the next 3 years. The trajectory is clear. Organizations that haven't made a platform decision yet will finally make one. You won't be able to avoid the question forever. At some point, you have to commit to an architecture. Most of those organizations will adopt the hybrid model, not because it's perfect, but because it's the least bad option given their constraints. They'll keep Azure DevOps for governance-heavy workloads, move to GitHub for innovation workloads, and build the integration between them. The organizations that go all in on one platform, either pure GitHub or staying on pure ADO, will represent the extremes. GitHub only will be early-stage, cloud-native organizations with low regulatory burden. ADO only will be legacy-heavy organizations in highly regulated industries that can't afford to fragment their governance. The middle, which is most of the Fortune 500, will be hybrid. Compliance requirements will get tighter. The EU AI Act is just the opening move. Other countries will follow. International harmonization is coming, and every regulation that gets added will make governance more important, which makes Azure DevOps more valuable for the workloads that require it. Meanwhile, AI capabilities will keep advancing. GitHub's competitive advantage will be in AI-assisted development. Organizations will want that advantage for their innovation workloads, so they'll use GitHub for those. and they'll use Azure DevOps for the workloads where compliance matters more than velocity. The integration between GitHub and Azure DevOps will improve, not to the point where they feel like one platform, but to the point where a hybrid setup feels like a deliberate architectural choice, not a messy compromise. Platform teams will become standard. Right now, they're emerging. In 3 years, most large organizations will have a dedicated platform team responsible for managing their GitHub and Azure DevOps footprint and the integration between them. The implementation roadmap. If you've decided hybrid is right for your organization, and you're probably correct if you're Fortune 500 or close to it, here's the roadmap. Phase 1. The audit. This happens in months 1 through 3. Do the honest inventory I mentioned earlier, count your repositories, count your pipelines, understand your boards and test plans usage, measure your current governance, understand your regulatory requirements by workload. This phase is boring. It's also essential because you can't make good decisions without accurate data. Phase 2, the classification. This happens in months 2 through 4. Classify workloads using the decision framework, not all at once. Start with the major application families. Understand which characteristics matter most. Document your reasoning. Don't try to be perfect. You'll be wrong about some. That's okay. You'll learn as you go. Phase 3, the pilot. This happens in months 4 through 8. Pick one low-risk greenfield project. Move it to GitHub following your integration pattern and governance model. Run it for 3 to 6 months in production. Document everything that broke. Document what worked better than expected. Document the integration issues you hit. And the team dynamics. This pilot teaches you more than all the planning in the world. Phase 4, the scale. This happens in months 8 through 18. Based on the pilot, refine your patterns. Then start rolling out to other workloads. Don't move everything at once. Move in cohorts. Let each cohort teach you something. Keep Azure DevOps and GitHub running in parallel during this phase. The duplication is expensive. It's also necessary for safety. Phase 5, the stabilization. This happens in months 18 through 24. By this point, you've moved significant workloads. You've built integration patterns. You've solved most of the integration problems. Now you optimize. This is where you actually decommission Azure DevOps for the workloads that have fully moved. You keep it for the workloads that need it. You might reduce your ADO footprint by 30 to 40%, but you're unlikely to get to zero if you're regulated at all. Phase 6, the continuous improvement. This is year 2 and beyond. You're now running hybrid. The platform team takes over. The monthly reviews start. The measurement regime operates. You adjust allocations based on evidence. This is the operational mode. It's not dramatic. It's not about big migrations. It's about managing a complex platform portfolio and optimizing outcomes. This roadmap takes 2 years. It's not fast, but it's a realistic timeline for a large organization to move significant workloads without breaking production, without losing compliance, and without triggering a 28% cost spike. The real conversation you should be having. If a CIO asked me about this tomorrow, here's what I would tell them. You aren't going to pick one. You probably know that already, even if you haven't admitted it yet. The economics don't work, the compliance doesn't work, the innovation requirements don't work, so stop planning as if you're going to pick a winner. Instead, plan how you'll operate both, design governance that works in 2 places, build the integration that connects them, set up a platform team to manage that complexity. Then, measure the outcomes to see if your allocation is actually right. It sounds boring, but boring isn't wrong. The organizations moving the fastest are the ones accepting this complexity instead of fighting it. They aren't looking for the one true platform. They aren't debating which one is better. They're answering the actual strategic question. Which workloads live where and how do we govern them? That's a different conversation. It's practical, it's less exciting for the industry narrative, but it's the only conversation that matters. You're going to use both. GitHub for your innovation agenda, Azure DevOps for your compliance agenda, and integration to make them talk. The question isn't whether you'll do it. The question is how well you'll do it. That's where the advantage actually lies.